Thanks very much, Chloe. I'm just going to get my slides uploaded and then hopefully we can get things started. So while those are loading, just to say a big thanks to Chloe for organising this event and for inviting me to speak today. This is the first time I've done one of the Aberdeen alumni talks, so I'm very excited to be here. Okay, so I'm gonna kick things off. Chloe, if you can just confirm that you can see my slides, is that
Yep, all good.
great? Well, we'll make a start then. So 280 years ago, on the 16th of April 1746, a bloody battle took place on a moor near Inverness in the far north of Scotland. On one side was the forces of Britain's Hanoverian government, led by Prince William, Duke of Cumberland and younger son of King George II. On the other were supporters of the exiled Stuarts, the dynasty that had ruled Scotland since 1371 and England and Scotland since 1603, until the overthrow and exile of King James II of England and 7th of Scotland in 1688. This army was seeking to return James's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, sometimes known as the Old Pretender, to what they saw as his rightful place on the throne. Leading this army of Jacobites, the term Jacobites coming from the Latin Jacobus for James, was Charles Edward Stuart, Jacobite Prince of Wales and grandson of that long ago exiled and deposed king. The Battle of Culloden is the culmination of a months-long rising against the Hanoverian government. It had begun in July 1745, when Charles Edward Stuart landed on the island of Erskine and raised the Jacobite standard at Glenfinnan. Now, Charles had won some spectacular military victories. He had established a Jacobite court in Edinburgh, and he had marched into England with the ambition of reaching London and overthrowing the Hanoverians. But at a crucial moment, his army had turned back. Pursued by government forces, the decision was taken by what remained of the Jacobite army to make a stand on Culloden Moor. Culloden was the last pitched battle to take place on British soil. It wasn't an especially long battle. It lasted approximately 40 minutes, so basically your average episode of a television show. But in that time, approximately 1,600 men lost their lives, and about 1,500 of those were on the Jacobite side. Though people at the time did not know it, this battle brought an inglorious end to the Jacobite movement as a serious political force. These events that I've just outlined may well be a familiar story to many of you here today. Culloden 1745 and Jacobitism attract considerable popular interest, and especially in the last 10 years or so, thanks to the popularity of the books and TV series Outlander. The Rising of 1745 was the culmination of a series of military insurrections and plots over the previous half-century, all instigated with this aim of restoring the exiled Stuarts. The major risings of 1745 and 1715 were accompanied by abortive risings, alongside various plots and planned uprisings that never really got off the ground. So much of what we think we know about Culloden, about 1745, and about the Jacobite movement in general is encapsulated in this painting, An Incident in the Rebellion of 1745. Now, this was a painting by David Maurier, who was an Anglo-Swiss artist. It may be familiar to some of you. It was completed between 1747 and 1753, and today it hangs in the lobby of the Palace of Holyrood House. It was commissioned as part of a series of military paintings showing different fighting techniques, and this one shows the famed Highland charge that was sort of the last stand of the Jacobites at Culloden. Maurier wasn't present at this battle, but he based his depictions of Highlanders on Jacobite prisoners that filled the London and Essex prisons after the Rising. This is painted as a piece of anti-Jacobite propaganda. There is little to see in this painting where the Highland side come across as strong, as on the cusp of victory, as an enemy worth fighting. And yet, in many ways, this picture has become totemic of the Jacobite movement as a whole. And it gives the impression of the rising of 1745 as this clash between these very binary and starkly divided forces. So on one side, we have Highlanders, on the other side, we have Hanoverians, Catholics versus Protestants, Scotland versus England, and perhaps even tradition versus modernity. But this image tells only one part of the story, both about the rising of 1745 and the wider Jacobite movement. It sets up stark divisions that in many ways just did not exist. That clear-cut split down the middle of the image between tartan-clad Highlanders and pro-Hanoverian redcoats obscures the fact that Jacobitism was about far more than just the Highlands, or indeed just Scotland. Jacobitism was an international movement that attracted supporters from across the three kingdoms of Scotland, England, and Ireland. The exiled Stuarts based in France and later Italy cultivated strong European connections, and Jacobitism also flourished in the colonies of Britain's emerging empire. Not all Jacobites were Scots, but equally, not all Scots were Jacobites. This painting masks a far more complicated and, I think, interesting historical reality. So what I want to do in today's talk is to try and unpack some of these complexities. So that we can better understand Culloden and its place within the wider Jacobite movement. So what I'll do today is I'll give a brief overview of where Jacobitism comes from, why it emerges, and the kinds of people who were drawn into this movement and their motivations for doing so. And I'll then look at the key issues at stake by the time we get to 1745 and why this rising is seen as the chief symbol of the Jacobite cause. And we'll then finish by looking at some of the cultural legacies of Culloden. So the origins of the Jacobite movement lie a good half-century before Culloden. The event that sparked the emergence of this movement is an event known as the Revolution of 1688 to 90. And this is the event that brings about that exile of James VII and II, who we see on the right. So why was James overthrown? It's a bit of a complicated story. James is the younger brother of King Charles II, who was restored to the thrones of the three kingdoms in 1660 after over a decade of civil war and Cromwellian Republican government. And yeah, sorry to interrupt. My computer decided that this was a great moment to try and restart the system, but I've got rid of that now, so I'll carry on. Charles dies in 1685 without any legitimate children, so the throne passes to James, his younger brother, as his nearest heir. But many people are very worried about the prospect of James on the throne. One of the binaries that I mentioned earlier was the idea of Catholics versus Protestants. And in many ways, the 17th century is characterised by fears of what's known as popery, this derogatory term for Catholics and Catholicism. Now, Scotland's Catholic population is actually very small. In 1680, it's estimated to be only about 2% of the population, so about 24,000 people. But that 2% is clustered overwhelmingly in the Highlands, the Hebrides, and the North East. Charles II was Protestant, but in 1669, James, as Duke of York, converted to Catholicism, and this was genuinely terrifying. Protestants could not countenance the thought of a Catholic on the throne again, and there were even attempts by Parliament to exclude James from the line of succession because of his Catholicism. There's a lot of ruckus about this in the 1670s and 1680s, but James does come to the throne peacefully. But he quickly becomes very unpopular, largely because of his religious policies. So James starts making various efforts to repeal all of this anti-Catholic legislation that's on the statute book in England and Scotland. And in 1687, he issues a series of indulgences. So this is legislation which suspends penal laws against Catholics and enables them to worship freely. James has been hailed by modern historians as sort of a bold experimenter in what we would call religious toleration, but at the time what he was doing was completely anathema. And it was especially worrying because James was issuing these indulgences without consulting Parliament. And so this provokes criticisms that James is acting in an arbitrary manner. There's the phrase in this period, arbitrary government, that is really, really crucial. But James might have clung on were it not for one event, that on The 10th of June 1688, his wife, Mary of Modena, gives birth to a son. Protestants are now confronted with not just James, but a potential long line of Catholic monarchs, and this is absolutely terrifying. It was this event that prompted 7 English lords to invite James's son-in-law, William of Orange, to intervene with James. That's quite an ambiguous invitation, and William responds to it and interprets it by gathering an invasion force, landing in Devon on the 5th of November 1688. Now, I mentioned earlier that Jacobitism is an international movement, and we really need to understand the international context here. At this point, Louis XIV, King of France, is waging a series of wars at home and abroad, and he had unleashed a wave of persecution against France's Protestants. In 1685, he revokes France's legal toleration for Protestants. It's known as the Edict of Nantes. Louis gets rid of this, and this unleashes a wave of religious refugees fleeing France because they are being persecuted and killed by a very aggressive style of counter-Reformation Catholicism. People look at what Louis XIV was doing and they worry that James's indulgences are the first step on this road. And William of Orange was terrified about French expansion. So in invading the three kingdoms, William was trying to preserve the balance of power in Europe. But this situation is a bit more complicated than Catholic versus Protestant. William had the backing of a major European army, which included Catholics, particularly the Austrian Habsburgs. In the war that unfolded, more Catholics fought for William than they ever did for James, and William had the backing of the Pope to remove James as an arbitrary ruler. Religion and politics were hugely complicated in this period. So William's landing triggers the collapse of James's government north and south of the border. And James flees to France. He arrives there on Christmas Day, 1688, and a temporary Jacobite court is established at the Palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is near Versailles. England and Scotland both call Parliament to implement a settlement to justify what's just happened. And in Scotland, what happens is that the Scottish Parliament says that James has forfeited his right to the throne because of his behaviour. And so they are completely justified in overthrowing him. And they produce a document known as the Claim of Right to explain and to justify this argument. And so the Claim of Right enables the Scottish Parliament to depose James as a tyrannical ruler and offer the crown to James's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. But this revolution settlement triggers a civil war, not just in Scotland, but also in Ireland. And in Scotland, this conflict was spearheaded by this man, John Graham of Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee. Now, Dundee had attended the convention, but he walked out 4 days after it began, disgusted. Escaping arrest, he journeyed in Perthshire, Angus and the Highlands, gaining supporters and building an army. Early victory at the Battle of Killiecrankie bolstered hopes for a swift Jacobite restoration. But Dundee died on the battlefield and there was no obvious alternative leader to take his place. Moreover, most of the greater families of northern Scotland had declined to support Dundee. Less than a month after Killiecrankie, the Jacobite forces were defeated at the Battle of Dunkeld. Now, you get various skirmishes and low-level resistance that continues until late in 1691. But as long as the, quote, king over the water and his family remained alive, there was potential for a Jacobite restoration to happen. Military defeat does not mark the end of the Jacobite cause. So there's a lot of stereotypes and perhaps misunderstanding about what Jacobitism was and the kinds of people who supported this idea. And one of the biggest ideas is that Jacobitism was this Highland phenomenon. Now, it makes a lot of sense that people think this. Jacobitism in many ways sort of starts and ends in the Highlands. We've just talked about the Highland War. Major incidents in Jacobite history, like the Massacre of Glencoe, the 1715 Rising, the 1745 Rising, they have their beginnings and their endings in the Highlands. And the exiled Stuarts themselves, moreover, adopt Highland symbols as part of their regalia. So we see a picture of the young Charles Edward Stuart here, dressed in tartan. But there is no such thing as one type of Highlander, just as much as there is no one type of Jacobite. And I just want to talk a little bit about this idea of clanship and Jacobitism, this idea that all of the clans were out in 1745. Well, they weren't, or if they were, they weren't always on the Jacobite side. Um, These are some of the major Highland clans. I've just pulled these from an excellent book by Dr. Alan MacInnes about clanship and the House of Stuart. And what we can see is that you have certain clans who are steadfast Jacobites, like the Gordons or the MacDonalds of Clanranald, but you also have what are known as Whig clans, ones who support William of Orange and later the Georgian monarchs, the Hanoverians. And even more interestingly, you have clans who change sides or who are divided. So the Campbells of Glenorchy were neutral in 1689, they were Jacobite in 1715, and they were Whig in 1745. And we have the MacDougalls, who in 1745 were divided. I will talk about them a bit later on. So the Highlands form a really important constituency of Jacobitism, but they are not the only constituency. And we need to think about other things like religion as well. Catholics form the backbone of Jacobite support in Ireland and also in England. But in Scotland, most Jacobites are actually Protestants, and they're a particular type of Protestant known as Episcopalian. So Scottish Protestantism at this point is divided into two main camps. You have Episcopalians and Presbyterians. In 1660, the Church of Scotland was re-established as Episcopalian, so they're the ones who are in charge when James is on the throne. But in 1690, that system is replaced with a Presbyterian system. And the reason for this is because most Episcopalians argue that they couldn't support William of Orange's legitimacy as ruler. They believe in this idea called indefeasible hereditary right. James was put on this throne by God, and it doesn't matter that he's a Catholic, it doesn't matter if he's a tyrant, there is nothing that you can do to change that succession. About a third of Scotland's population are Episcopalian in 1690, and they're particularly prominent north of the River Tay, where Dundee is. So the northeast of Scotland, the Highlands, and the far north. So this, in a way, kind of reorients where we think Jacobitism is at its strongest. It is very strong in the Highlands, but actually it's the northeast, it's Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire and places like Montrose that we really see the heartlands of Jacobite support. And even further south, you will see men and women of different classes at some point or another being drawn into this movement. Not everyone can be on the battlefield, but people express support for King James and his descendants, mostly through seditious toasting, drinking the health of the exiled king. So Jacobitism is something that is very capable of stirring strong feelings and emotions. And we need to think a little bit about the types of people who are drawn into this very strange world and what motivated them to effectively commit treason. And I've suggested that we can think about these in three main categories. We have first the diehards. These are the ardently committed Jacobites. These are the ones who will constantly engage in active subterfuge and open rebellion to bring about their exiled Stuart restoration. So people like the MacDonalds of Clanranald, politicians like Sir George Lockhart of Carnwath. Then we have another group of people, what I've termed the discontented. These are individuals who have the potential to be drawn into the Jacobite cause, depending on what's going on at the time. It's this idea that Jacobitism represents an alternative political reality. And if circumstances are right, these are the kinds of people who can lend their support to this cause, but they're not necessarily as committed as the diehards. And then finally, you have opportunists, individuals who throw in their lot with the Jacobites because they have few other options and little or nothing to lose. Talking about reasons and motivations, there's one particular motivation for supporting Jacobitism in Scotland that does not apply in England or Ireland. And This is the Union of 1707 and relatedly the Hanoverian succession. So after William and Mary we have Queen Anne. Queen Anne has no living children and the problem is, well, we can't bring back the Stuarts because they're Catholic, so what do we do? And so this very complicated mechanism is contrived whereby the throne will pass to the nearest Protestant heir, who turns out to be in Hanover in Germany, the Hanoverian succession. To go into the causes of the Union is a whole other talk, so I will just say very briefly that the Union inspires significant debate in Scotland, to say the least. Not everyone opposed the Union, but plenty did, and it was this opposition that really gives Jacobitism an impetus, and it's what becomes the mainstay of Jacobite support, and it enables it to remain relevant in the 18th century, because the idea is that if you can bring back the exiled Stuarts, they will dissolve the Union. And this is seen as a positive thing for Scotland. But while the Union is a hugely important factor within Jacobitism, it's too simplistic to see Jacobitism as some sort of proto-independence cause. Anti-Union did not necessarily equal pro-Jacobite. Families who opposed the Union in 1707 did not necessarily do so in 1745. And we'll see that what the Union does is it becomes really something of a millstone around the necks of the exiled Stuarts. So hopefully that's given people a bit of context as to when and why and how this movement emerges. So how do we get from this to 1745? By the 1740s, you might be forgiven for thinking that Jacobitism was in the doldrums. The last major plot, it was a plot called the Atterbury plot, had happened in the 1720s, in 1722. And it was a plot that had involved no Scottish dimension. Scottish Jacobitism in particular was seen as something of a spent force. The long-promised economic benefits of union were finally starting to materialise. Scotland is in a much better place than it had been a few decades previously, although its effects were felt unevenly. The major catalyst for 1745, it's not Scotland, it's what's happening abroad. We have another dynastic conflict known as the War of the Austrian Succession. And this conflict drew in all of the great powers of Europe and it pitted Britain and France against each other. Domestic origins of 1745 don't emerge in Scotland, but they emerge in England. So a group of English Jacobites, they invite the French government to invade England and restore the exiled Stuarts. Why would the French agree to this? Well, from France's perspective, it's actually quite good to be able to undermine your enemy. And this is where the Jacobites are able to retain a lot of relevance because it's this idea of playing the Jacobite card. It's always a possibility for France or Italy or Spain to be able to use the Jacobites, the exiled Stuarts, as some sort of political leverage. Louis XV did not agree to this idea straight away. He wants assurances that there will be a parallel uprising in England because that's the only way that a landing would ever work. But in 1743, he orders his generals to start preparing for an invasion. The plan was scuppered at the last minute when the British government uncovered this plot and they arrested leading English Jacobites. And then the French fleet was partly wrecked by a storm and the whole invasion is called off. But when those plans were underway, Charles Edward Stuart, who's in his 20s at this point, he is the grandson of James VII and II, the son of James Francis Edward. So Charles is known as the Young Pretender. And he'd been smuggled into France to be involved with this planned invasion. And when the invasion's called off, he just kind of hangs around in Paris for a good year, basically waiting to see what's going to happen. And at a certain point, he resolves that he is going to proceed to Scotland himself, expecting that a renewed French fleet would follow. And it's worth noting that in doing so, he goes against the wishes of his father, and Charles and James never speak from this point on. This is the moment when Charles, with his small band of followers, lands in the Hebrides and then a few weeks later raises the Jacobite standard at Glenfinnan. But we have to ask, what's his reception like? Is there a lot of popular support for this rising, particularly among Highlanders? And the short answer is actually no, there isn't. The Highland clan leaders are very suspicious. They are very reluctant to join a rising without firm evidence of French support. They want to see an army, they want to see arms, they want to see ammunition, because they know that without that French backing, this is all going to be a bit pointless. And it's only when Charles managed to convince one particular clan chief, Donald Cameron of Lochiel, to join him, that other clans gradually drifted to the cause. But the 1745 rising attracted not as much popular support as we might think. In 1715, 30 years previously, a peak of 20,000 Scots had been involved in that rising, whereas only about 13,000 came out in 1745. So that's really interesting to think about. Why were people not more willing to join this cause? Well, a lot of it comes down to what had happened 30 years earlier. The Jacobite rising in 1715 had been decisively defeated. Now, the government was quite canny. They pursued lots of policies of leniency. They wanted to avoid making political martyrs, so you only get a handful of executions. However, Jacobites had their estates forfeited, and they were very strongly encouraged to go into voluntary exile abroad. And this pushed many families into poverty, even though gradually many were able to claim their estates back. So some families who had been out in 1715 refused to come out in 1745. I mentioned earlier the MacDougalls. So the MacDougalls of Dunolly, near Auburn, supported the Jacobite cause, and they fought at the Battle of Sheriffmuir. But in 1745, when he was asked, Alexander MacDougall remembered what had happened to his father, who was forced to endure over a decade of exile in France, and the poverty that he and his mother endured while his father was separated from them. And Alexander prudently decided to stay at home. But his younger brother did go out to support the Jacobites. So these allegiances are really not straightforward. Jacobitism creates divisions within families, including within Highland clans. Highland clan leaders, though, they want guarantees that Charles simply can't give, but he is very good at convincing people. And gradually this army is brought together. Most of it doesn't come from the Highlands, but again from the northeast, from those Jacobite heartlands. Charles's army did far better than initially expected. They get to Edinburgh. Charles establishes a Jacobite court at Holyrood House, although he never takes Edinburgh Castle, and Jacobite victory follows at the Battle of Prestonpans. But it's in Edinburgh that we see tensions emerging within the Jacobite movement. One tension was caused by the decisions of Lord George Murray, son of the Duke of Atholl, who Charles had appointed Lieutenant General of the Jacobite forces. Now, Murray was not a particularly popular figure, and he made several unpopular propositions. First, he suggested that no Catholics should serve on Charles's council. So we see that ongoing religious tension running through the Jacobite cause. Here is a Protestant supporting the restoration of a Catholic king, but not necessarily liking Catholics very much. A bigger question was the issue of the Union. Some Scots in Charles's inner circle wanted Charles to promise that he would dissolve the Union as a way of getting more support. But his English and Irish supporters did not want this. They are not interested in the question of union. And this is a major problem for the Jacobite movement because it represents different things to different people. Now, Charles did issue a proclamation in Scotland in 1745 promising to dissolve the Union, but it's highly doubtful whether he actually meant it. It wasn't in his interest to dissolve this union. Charles's hand was forced, and he did it basically to keep the Scots on side. There's a historian, Geoffrey Stephen, who has described this as a clash between Scottish nationalism and Stuart unionism. Indeed, Lord George Murray also opposed this declaration. The other tension at the council was whether to march into England or stay in Scotland. Charles was for marching south, but his Scottish advisors were against. And again, we have to think about what this division tells us. For Charles and the exiled Stuart royal family, England was the ultimate prize. England was the seat of power. Scotland was a means to an end, but not an end in itself. And Charles is not especially inclined to listen to advice, as sources from the period tell us. So the Jacobite army marches south. And this is where the real cracks appeared. Strategically, they took completely the wrong route. What they should have done is gone down the east coast to Newcastle and cut off the coal supply to London. But they didn't, they marched down the west coast. Now, Charles thought he would get more support in the Catholic heartlands of Cumbria and Lancashire, and he does get some support in Manchester. But largely, this Jacobite support fails to materialise. English Jacobites may be happy to drink to the exiled king, but they stay at home. Lack of English support was compounded by lack of French support. By the time the army reached Derby, these problems were becoming too difficult to ignore. Winter was coming on, food supplies were not sufficient, and there were rumours of large government-backed forces mustering. And for many of Charles's supporters, these problems are just becoming too difficult to ignore. So on the 6th of December 1745, we have a meeting of Charles's military council led by Murray, and it overrules Charles's objections and says that the Jacobite army is going to turn back to Scotland. Now, notes of the council that survive show us the divisions that are really rivening through this movement. So the quote that I've put on the slide there, Lord George told him, the prince, that it was the opinion of everybody present that the Scots had now done all that could be expected of them. They had marched into the heart of England, ready to join any party that would declare for him, that none had. That there was no French landed, they had never so much as either sent him money or intelligence or the least advice what to do. And even if they got to London, and beat the Duke of Cumberland's army, which at this point was some 7,000 strong, they would still have the London population to deal with. As Murray said, 4,500 men would not make a great figure in London. Murray is opposed in this by the Irish contingent, who are all for marching on, but in the end, the Scots won out. So we see that this is a movement that really lacks unity of purpose. Beyond that big goal of restoring the exiled Stuarts, national, religious, and political tensions are a constant feature of Jacobitism, and they're all encapsulated in this council meeting, and they really could not be resolved. The retreating Jacobite forces were pursued by the Hanoverian army. But that army, we need to remember, also included Scots, and crucially, it included Highlanders. So to give just one example, Adam Ferguson, the historian, philosopher, key figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, was appointed deputy chaplain of the 43rd Regiment of the Hanoverian Army, also known as the Black Watch. In December 1745, Ferguson preached a rousing sermon in Gaelic. Ferguson was born and brought up in Perthshire, to the regiment, arguing that the disruption and strife caused by this rebellion were signs of God's displeasure. For Ferguson, it is patriotic to oppose the rising. That is what a true Scot and a true Briton should do. So again, we see that these allegiances are really not straightforward. Scots fought on both sides. And all of this culminates at Culloden. Now, Charles wanted to reassert his position over his military officers. He feels that he's been sidelined, but the lead up to the battle revealed his lack of strategic capability. The army was in disarray and really poorly equipped to fight. Desertions have happened all along the way, so by the time we get to Culloden, the Jacobite army is considerably shrunk. The choice of battleground was completely wrong. In many ways, it played into the Hanoverian army's hands. And the crushing defeat that followed was absolute, but Charles still thought he could regroup, so he fled the battlefield, he hid in a cottage, and he sort of skulked around the Highlands for several months, before finally escaping back to the continent. Culloden was not the end of the Jacobite cause, but it marked the end of any armed insurrection or insurrectionary attempts in mainland Britain to restore the Stuarts. So this is a conflict that draws in all different strands. We have Scots, we have English Jacobites, we have Irish Jacobites, we do have a small French contingent on the battlefield at Culloden. So why is it that the Highlands have emerged as the sort of the key image and idea associated with Jacobitism? Well, partly it's because of what happened immediately after the battle. Unlike in 1716, when the government pursued broadly lenient policies, in 1746 there were reprisals and retributions of the highest order. Now, it began with killing of soldiers on the field and then extended to those who sheltered Jacobites, and it soon became a widespread and systematic campaign of repression. Cumberland quickly gained the moniker Butcher Cumberland. Even considering the time period, the retributions were particularly brutal. These reprisals targeted Highlanders in particular. Jacobites in the northeastern lowlands, as I said, turned out in greater numbers, but they do not experience reprisals in the same way. They are treated far less severely. The Highlanders, by contrast, were treated as savage outsiders. And this is reflected in legislation that's passed in the years after 1746 that's designed to address what's known as the Highland problem. Culloden was significant then, not merely because it effectively brought an end to active military Jacobitism, but because of its cultural legacies around the idea of the Highlands and Highlanders in particular. Because while in 1746, the idea of being tarred with the same brush as a Highlander would have been anathema, in the later 18th and 19th centuries, we see something of a process of rehabilitation going on. And in the process, Jacobites and Highlanders become almost inextricably intertwined. So writers such as Robert Burns and Walter Scott popularised a vision of Scottish history and folklore that relied heavily on myth. The bleak, inaccessible Highland landscape was remarketed as picturesque. And tartan, once disparaged as primitive and barbaric, was readopted as a Scottish symbol, not merely as a Highland symbol. Famously, in 1822, during George IV's visit to Edinburgh, the king and the nobility appeared in kilts. Gradually, the Jacobites and the Highlands were romanticised rather than demonised. And this created a number of myths about the Jacobite movement that placed the Highlands front and centre. So, this is a painting of Charles Edward Stuart, created in about 1892, so well over a century after the 45, and it supposedly depicts a scene from 1745 after Charles's conquest of Edinburgh. It's Charles entering the ballroom at Holyrood House. Charles, as we see, is in tartan, and he is flanked by two Highland clansmen, Donald Cameron of Lochiel and Alexander Forbes of Pitsligo. An unseen audience throws flowers and ribbons at his feet. But this scene is a fabrication. It never happened. It is taken from Walter Scott's Waverley. It tells us far more about Walter Scott's romantic fascination with the Highlands than it does about the realities of the Jacobite court in Edinburgh in 1745. Much of this romanticisation, however, was created by Jacobites themselves. Now, we see this in several different ways. We see it in England and Wales in the form of Jacobite drinking societies. The amount of Jacobite drinking glasses that do not have anything to do with the actual active Jacobite period, but are later 18th and 19th century creations, is astonishing. It's this idea of Jacobitism as a social phenomenon. In Scotland, we see it in the form of Gaelic poetry and song. Again, many of these pieces were composed long after 1745, including the famous Skyboat song. But there are efforts to memorialise what had happened by Jacobites themselves, and I think the best example of this is The Lion in Mourning. Now, this is a manuscript collection of eyewitness accounts and memoirs collated from the 1750s by the Scottish Episcopalian Jacobite clergyman Robert Forbes. Forbes had wanted to participate in 1745, but he was captured and imprisoned before Culloden, so he couldn't take part in it. This collection, it's extensive. It runs to about 9 volumes, and it includes speeches, letters, poems, pamphlets, even scraps of cloth. And it really cements this idea of tragedy, which became a hugely important element of the Scottish romanticisation of Jacobitism. Leith Davis, who is working on a huge digitisation project of this, I've put the link on the slide there, she describes this collection as a site of Jacobite cultural memory. Now, it commemorated the past, but The Lion in Mourning also shows how figures like Forbes were constructing narratives about Jacobitism in their own time. Jacobitism as a cultural phenomenon lasts long after Culloden and continues to have significance long after Jacobitism as a political force. And we see this sort of merging of Jacobitism and Highlandism in the place where it all began, in the Glenfinnan monument completed in 1815. This was erected by Alexander MacDonald, descendant of the MacDonalds of Clanranald, who were consistent Jacobites. Now, this monument was completed with a plaque dedicated to the generous zeal, the undaunted bravery, and the inviolable fidelity of the Jacobites. These processes of memorialisation create a narrowing of focus, to the point where Jacobitism seemed to encompass nothing but 1745 and the Highlanders as the sole Jacobites. And this is reinforced in 1835 when that figure of the unknown Highlander was added to the top of the memorial. Memorialisation by Jacobites themselves and later generations thus romanticised this conflict, and it created narratives about Jacobitism that as historians we are still grappling with and trying to unpick. So where does all of this leave us? The title of this talk was The Road to Culloden, but that implies a sense of inevitability and also one direction. As with so many historical movements, there was little that was inevitable about Culloden. And rather than thinking of a road to Culloden, we should instead think of several roads. Jacobitism was never simply one thing. It was an idea that attracted different people at different times for different purposes. That flexibility and adaptability was both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It ensured that Jacobitism remained a significant threat for much of the 18th century, but it was a key reason why the Jacobite movement was never able to achieve its ultimate goal. To return to David Maurier's painting, I hope I've shown that this was a movement far more complex than this image suggests. But that, to me at least, is what makes Jacobitism so interesting, because it has so many layers. I highly doubt that the people on the battlefield at Culloden in 1746 would think that 280 years later we would still be talking about this moment and what it means, but I'm very glad that we are. So I will draw this to a close and stop sharing my screen.
And I will jump back on to say thank you so much. That was fascinating and just like so much information. And I feel
Sorry.
like being brought, no, no, not in a bad way. I just like feel like being brought up in Scotland. I think that you kind of dealt like you, t there's so many touch points where you get a little insight into, um, like I guess the history, but maybe not the kind of the truth behind it, or
Yeah.
I think you kind of delve more into like the actual reality of the situation, and I had been completely unaware that I just hadn't really considered that there would be support in the northeast, because yeah, I do think it's always like you think Highlands, like Catholicism, that they're your supporters. I hadn't even considered that there would be, yeah, people who, yeah, from different parts of the community in Scotland who would be, I'm kind of rambling there, and I can see some questions that are popping in. So I will move on to that, move on to the concise questions rather than my own rambles. So the first one's from Eleanor. So can you tell us anything about the different fighting techniques at Culloden? For example, the Highland charge.
So this is where my limits as a historian will become painfully apparent, because I am not a military historian. The Highland Charge is what I can tell you is that the Highland Charge is known as the most famous moment of this particular battle. In terms of the specific details, though, about fighting techniques, that unfortunately is beyond my capability, and I'd be afeared of saying something and exposing my own ignorance on it. But it's interesting, though, isn't it? Because there's this constant association of the Highlanders as being seen as having this incredible martial culture, and the government is not afraid to take advantage of this. So even before 1745, the government sends a group of Highlanders out to the recently established colony of Georgia in what's now the USA. And they do this specifically because they think that the Highlanders and Native Americans will be able to understand one another, because they both have these similar martial traditions. And then there's the whole process in the later 18th century where Highlanders get incorporated into the British Army. I wish I knew more about specific fighting techniques, but as I say, I'm not a specific military historian, but I will endeavour to find out more about this.
Thank you. Our next question is, were the border clans involved? Clare being one of the names that's the surnames mentioned.
So the Kerrs were involved in 1745. So actually, when I said that most of the casualties were on the Jacobite side, which is true, but actually one of the few prominent government supporters to die on the Culloden battlefield was Robert Kerr. So they fight, but they fight on the government side. That to me is not surprising, because at this point the Kerrs are quite strongly Presbyterian, so it would make sense that they are on that Whig side.
Thank you. Next one, what if the Jacobites had won, is the next question.
What if they had won?
Yeah.
I mean, it is an interesting question. There's all these sort of counterfactuals, like what if they hadn't turned back at Derby?
Mhm.
Well, I find when I was doing sort of my research for this talk, I did find it quite interesting that even when they were at Derby, there's quite a level of cynicism as to, well, even if we do get to London, can we actually take it? It's not necessarily us dismissing the Jacobites as this serious political force. It's people at the time saying, I don't know if this is possible. However, if they had won, and also you've got to define victory. What does victory look like? When you say, what if they'd won, if they had stayed in Scotland and remained in Scotland and dissolved the Union, kept this idea of the Union of Crowns, that would still involve some sort of insurrection in England. And then we also have to think about Ireland as well. Ireland would have welcomed the exiled Stuarts back with open arms. That wasn't really the issue. But the problem is England and making sure that there would be enough English support there. If the Jacobites had won, though, I mean, again, we're going into the realms of speculation here. But given the style of rule, not so much James, but certainly Charles Edward Stuart was inclined to do, I wouldn't have been surprised if there'd been some sort of French revolutionary situation and that they would have got rid of monarchs altogether. The Stuarts are very slow to let go of this idea of what their critics call arbitrary rule. Charles Edward Stuart, in particular, is not keen on taking advice from people, and that's a problem.
Thank you. I was like, that is a big question. So well done,
Yeah.
well done answering it.
I mean, no one can answer it though, can
No,
they?
but you can create,
We're
you
just
can kind of
guessing.
delve.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about.
The next one is, what about the universities in Aberdeen, or the university in Aberdeen? Was there, or universities, were there divided opinions there too?
That's a fascinating question. Thank you very much. Yes, there were. So this is more relevant in 1715 in that particular rising. But so Aberdeen is made up of two colleges. You have King's College and Marischal College, and the stereotype goes that King's was very staunchly Jacobite and Marischal not. King's College in 1715, a lot of its students do come out very strongly in support of the rising. And in January 1716 or thereabouts, a group of students, they march down what's now College Bounds and they burn a picture of George I outside the entrance to King's College. So there is real strong Jacobite sentiment there. There are some amazing postgraduate students at Aberdeen working on this idea of Jacobite education and what that means. So yes, the universities in Aberdeen in particular do get very involved in Jacobitism. Aberdeen, there's a bit of a purge after 1715 of sort of the more explicitly Jacobite teachers and professors, but those sentiments are still there and they still continue.
I'm going to jump a question and go back to it just because I feel like we're on theme. Because someone's asked, I believe Marshall was closed for a year in 1716 to 1717. And could you maybe like expand upon that?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, as I say, that old stereotype is that Marshall is seen as more um, pro Hanoverian. It's certainly against James, as in James the Seventh and Second. So at the Glorious Revolution, there's this Pope burning that happens. It's organised by students at Aberdeen. Um, and so it's their way of expressing their support for the revolution. And so that's important to remember. What happens is the principal of Marshall, he's a fellow called Robert Patterson, and he's dismissed basically due to his Jacobite sympathies, and so the university is closed while they try and find a replacement. And he's replaced by a fellow called Thomas Blackwell, who is a Church of Scotland minister. So he is very much seen as an establishment candidate. So that's a bit of the background to Marshall being closed there.
Thank you. Our next one, just to go back, is, do you
Yeah.
know what the motivation for Jacobites who were not Scottish would have been?
It's a great question, thank you. So for English and Irish Jacobites, the main motivation is religion. So Ireland at this point is a predominantly Catholic country. England has a small population of Catholics, but it's more significant than Scotland, and the English Catholic population is much more evenly distributed across the country. So for these people, it's about religion because they've experienced unprecedented freedoms under James. Um, and all of that is very abruptly taken away from them. It's interesting that in England, English Jacobites, they suffer a lot more than Scottish Jacobites in the aftermath of 1715 because they're Catholics and because there are more legal mechanisms to prosecute them. The other impact that this has that's really interesting is that in 1688, when James flees, the people who follow him to this exiled court are mostly English and Irish. That's like the first wave of Jacobite exiles. So you get this really strong Catholic court. You do have Protestants there, but it's only after the failed 1715 rising that you get a significant body of Scots being exiled in France and then, well, then in Italy, which is where the exiled court ends up. So for English and Irish Jacobites, it is overwhelmingly religion. But even then, you get some English Protestants who support the Jacobites, high church members of the Church of England, because again, excuse me, like Scotland's Episcopalians, they support this idea of indefeasible hereditary right. And it's very interesting. There are lots of accusations about certain types of English Protestants somehow being in league with the Jacobites. So Quakers are consistently accused of being in league with the Jacobites because, again, James has given them religious toleration. And for people who are in North America, there's this really interesting idea that William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, was somehow in league with James the Seventh and Second. So there's all sorts, as I say, in some ways it is a Catholic Protestant divide, but in other ways it really isn't. And it's really interesting to kind of uncover those complexities.
Thank you. Our next one is, you said that the Jacobites from the northeast were treated less violently than the Highland clans. My own family lost their land post Culloden. Were the penalties fiscal?
Penalties were fiscal, but they were also. It's not to say that there was no violence in the northeast. It's just that if you weren't in what was seen as being a Highland area, it was less. There was less physical violence. So around Glenlivet in the northeastern Highlands near Braemar, there was this Catholic seminary, and everyone knew that it was there, and that's burned to the ground by Hanoverian forces. For people who are in what's sort of further south, like Angus, Montrose, that kind of area, it is more fiscal. It's estates being confiscated, it's people being disinherited, but it is also people being, I say forced, encouraged strongly to go into what's known as voluntary exile. So you get a significant Jacobite diaspora of prisoners, people who are captured and basically told, well, you can either go to the colonies or we'll hang you here. Choice is yours. But you do have other families as well who are strongly encouraged that their interests are going to be better served outside of Scotland.
Thank you. So the next one is, how different might Highland society and culture be today if the 1745 uprising had never happened?
That's a really great question. And it's a very hard question because a lot of times people draw a link between the other horrific event that happens in the Highlands in this period, the clearances, and 1745. And there are connections between the two, but the clearances, this is getting into the 19th century, which I know far less about. It's the clearances, I would say, have a greater impact on Highland society and culture than the 45. So I mentioned all of this post-Culloden legislation that's come in, like, say, the banning of the wearing of tartan and banning of carrying of weapons and things like that. But actually, that's quite difficult to implement. And it depends on Highlanders on the ground actually enforcing it, and a lot of them just don't. There's an amazing historian called Matthew Zienick who's looked at how that post-Culloden legislation actually worked, and he shows us that there was flexibility there. It wasn't as stark as it appeared on paper. What 1745 does, though, is it decimates the population of the Highlands because, as I say, you have significant numbers of people who are either killed on the battlefield, die in prison, or then get sent to exile in the colonies of North America. And that then has long-term effects on the Highlands in terms of its productivity, which then sort of sows the seeds for the clearances. So you have to look at these two things together. It's very difficult to say what Highland society and culture would have been like without the 45. I guess the other thing to think about is language. So after 1745, the government and the Church of Scotland really step up its efforts to educate children in English. But even then, like, you get a Gaelic translation of the Bible in 1766. So as with so many things, it's very difficult to say. I think, and again, obviously it depends on subsequent events that happened later.
Thank you. And the next one is, yeah, how much difference, oh yeah, how much difference would a Jacobite victory at Culloden have made to the Jacobite movement?
That's a really good question. And I'm trying to think it through. It would depend on the nature of the victory. It would depend on what happened to the Hanoverian military leadership, but let's assume that it's a complete mirror image of what actually happened. So let's assume that the Hanoverian leadership is routed and the Hanoverian army is decimated. That would have made a huge difference in Scotland, because what that would have enabled the Jacobites to do, it would have been a huge morale boost. It would have encourage people to flock to the cause. So you've got a lot of people at this point who've deserted the army. If they hear of this victory, chances are they might actually come back. Because then, if you don't have a government force pursuing you and you're in an area that's quite geographically inaccessible, that's a really strong base. So, I mean, and that's sort of the idea of when they retreat from Derby back to the Highlands, is this idea that, well, we know this ground, we can defend this far better because we know the lay of the land. So I suspect that what would have happened is that Charles probably wouldn't have wanted to stay in the Highlands very long. He would have probably gone back to Edinburgh and re-established himself there. Um, in terms of longer term legacies of England, because again, that's always the question, and that's always what the exiled Stuarts ultimately want. I really can't answer that. But a victory at Culloden would have made a significant difference to Jacobites in Scotland.
Thank you. And I think maybe perhaps our final question is, how did the French view Culloden? Did they see the Jacobite loss as a missed opportunity to destabilize the British crown?
Yes and no. So this is always an issue with France. France uses the Jacobites for their own ends, and the French are often sort of the French government, moreover, are often playing their own game with this. It's very interesting that just a couple of years after 1745, the French actually do offer to fund a proper landing. This is the first time that they've done this, and they offer to fund an army of about 6,000 men. And Charles Edward Stuart, who's back in France at this point, refuses because he wants more. He wants an army of like tens of thousands of people. And the French say, well, we're not going to do that. And this causes relations between Charles and the French government to break down considerably, to the point where Charles Edward Stuart is bundled into a carriage and driven across the border. So he's kicked out of the country. So I suspect that at this point, it's we have to think about this in the context of that bigger European conflict that's going on. And France is probably focused more at this point on the bigger picture. A Jacobite victory at Culloden might have helped them, but the fact that it didn't happen, that's war, right? That's just the outcome of individual battles, and you have to deal with the reality in front of you. So I suspect in the moment, France was probably, I mean, France is quite preoccupied with theatre of conflict in Flanders at this point as well. So, and that's partly why they don't really send anything to Charles, even as they hear of his progress. So I suspect that their attentions at that moment are just more focused elsewhere.
Well, thank you. And I think that is all the questions. We've had lots of lovely comments already come in, just saying like, what a fantastic tour de force, a real eye opener, fascinating talk, wonderful presentation, excellent presentation, lots of lovely, lovely comments coming in. So thank
That's
you
very kind. Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you to everyone for coming, because yeah, it's a great topic.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I think we spoke about this earlier, and there's been so much interest in this topic, which has been really fantastic to see, but obviously it's not possible without Claire. So yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to do this with us. And thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today. I hope that you guys enjoy the rest of your afternoons and evenings. And we've got a very international audience joining us. So yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, mostly thank you to Claire. So yeah, thank you. And I think with our kind of online talks, we've got a little bit of a pause. And our next one will maybe be kind of later on in the year, but we'll keep everyone in the loop. And yeah, thanks again. We'll see you all at some point soon.